Hello, this is Claire Mitchell, and welcome to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Homeowners webinar. We're going to give everybody a few minutes to join. So in the meantime, we're going to ask a little icebreaker question. So this is a webinar about ponds and ponds management today. So I want to hear, what is one thing that you love about your waterfront pond, your waterfront property? What's something you love? And what's one thing that you think could be better about your pond? There's probably a reason why you're attending this webinar. It's probably not perfect. So let's look and see what we have in the chat box here. What? Nothing. Hello.
It's
What's one thing
chat
you love?
enabled. Oh, there we
Okay,
go.
watching the sunrises while doing dishes. Okay. Allison says she loves seeing wildlife. And what she could see better is HOAs encouraging FFL principles. Love that. We have a few people saying that they love seeing the wildlife. All right, tell me what wildlife you're seeing. You seeing any water birds? I want to know. We have, we got some wildlife, some turtles, birds, and alligators. The cooling breezes also sounds very nice. We have someone saying that they'd like to see less fertilizer on surrounding properties. Excellent FFL principle right there. Ooh, we see whistling ducks and turtles, lots of birds and cypresses. Okay, but Lynn, why are you here for the ponds management, guys? What are you protecting your pond from? Okay, oh my gosh, love the wildlife. There are otters, but hate the way our CDD removes beneficial plants. Says we would like to see better water clarity. I like that. Someone says overgrowth. I like that too. I've heard this actually several times recently. Some people have called in about how to stabilize the banks from erosion, that the mowers are about to fall in and the banks are just getting shorter and shorter. Things that I don't like is hurricanes that wash the shore away. Very similar problem here. The HOA is not keen on great water management, and this other person wants to avoid a seawall. Okay, ooh, we have some green stringy stuff growing. That's not good. Okay, we are getting some really great responses here. So it looks like everyone's really appreciating all the wildlife that their water provides, which is really awesome. I'm glad to hear that your ponds are providing habitat to some of the wildlife in your area. But it does look like we have some issues with erosion and buffer zones and chemical inputs that people are going to want advice on here. So I'm so glad that everybody is here to learn. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to read my little script here, everybody. So welcome to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Monthly Homeowner Webinar. This is a series given every third Tuesday of the month at 11 a.m. My name is Claire Mitchell. I'm the statewide education manager for FFL. And today we have Michelle Atkinson, who's going to speak with us about best management practices for your waterfront property. So first of all, your microphones have been muted. So if you have any questions, you're going to type them in the Q&A box instead of the chat box, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. So stick around till the end. We're going to have an exit survey, and it gives us an idea of the programming you like and lets us know how we're doing. Our next webinar will be at August 18th at 11 a.m. We'll be joined by Hannah Wooten-Eason, a commercial horticulture agent for Orange County Extension, and she's going to talk with us about palm problems and palm solutions. Okay, and as I said before, today we're going to be speaking with Michelle Atkinson. She is the environmental horticulture extension agent with Manatee County, and she specializes in stormwater management and sustainable landscapes. Her program provides workshops and research-based information to pest control, lawn and landscape, and golf course industries. So Michelle, thank you so much for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for having me here today. Yeah, like Claire was saying, I work with the commercial folks, which puts me in a pretty good position to be able to talk about the ponds to homeowners association and homeowners, because a lot of times we want our landscape or our pond to do things that they can't really do. And so, I come in with the research and the science to say, here's how these things can actually perform. Because sometimes we really are looking for the pie in the sky for some of, especially ponds. We all want that beautiful blue water with green grass right up to it, and that's just not really achievable in a stormwater pond. So let's get started here. Oh, and there we go. Okay, so we are going to talk about, we're going to understand what a stormwater pond actually is, a little bit about BMPs, which are best management practices, some things that we can do to help improve our pond. Of course, pollution, we always have to talk about that when we're talking about stormwater ponds, and then how we can support those buffer zones and get a healthy ecosystem going. So let's talk about these stormwater ponds, and unfortunately they are sold as lakefront property, which is not true. They are mostly stormwater ponds. They're engineered to be able to help us with flood control and with nutrient or pollution loading to try to reduce that stuff that comes off of our house and roads and lawns before it gets into our natural bodies of water. So the way that the pond is structured is we have our upland, which is, the land. So the watershed to that pond is the upland. We have a bank, which is the slope leading down into the pond, the littoral shelf, which is the area around the pond, and then sometimes there's actually a built shelf in there to allow plants to grow in that area. There's an inflow, which brings the water in from various places, and then an outflow. And again, all of these things work together to try to reduce nutrients, which is pollution. Try to reduce that pollution, tries to slow the runoff coming off of our property and then also off of our communities, trying to slow it so we don't have as much erosion in the downstream and in our natural bodies of water. So let's kind of look at what this looks like. Now, I did AI this photo, so it's got a huge inflow and a huge outflow on it, but it's hard to find a photo with everything you want in it. Unfortunately, their ponds are big and it's hard to get it all in one photo. So the inflow here is probably not what you see in your pond. It's probably just one pipe coming in. But that inflow is coming from rooftops and driveways, sidewalks, roads, off of the yards, and it's all bringing that water when it rains into the pond. We've got the open water, which is where the majority of the water is stored, trying to prevent that flooding. We've got the littoral shelf there with some nice pretty little plants on it. That's going to help us with some of that erosion that we're going to talk about a little bit later. We have the bank, and when we're talking about the bank, there's really two parts of the bank. There is the slope bank, so what's out of the water but is sloping, and then there is the top of bank, which is the higher side where it's evens out and levels out somewhat. And then across the pond you can see the outflow structure. Now, in many communities, ponds are tied together. They call it a treatment chain. So you may be in a pond that is the first receiving waters pond, or you may be living on a pond that is the 8th in the chain, which means that 7 ponds before it have overflowed now into this pond. And sometimes those ponds can be a little problematic because they tend to get a little more pollution in them than some of the ones up at the top of the treatment chain. Sometimes not so much, but sometimes they can be a little more problematic. So when you're driving around a community, I hear this all the time, why does this pond look clear, but this pond doesn't? And they're right across the street from each other. Well, they may be on 2 totally separate treatment chains, and one may be at the start and one may be at the end. These little ponds and big ponds, they get kind of complicated sometimes in what's flowing into them, and then also how they're structured. Sometimes, especially in my area, I'm coastal and I'm over here under Tampa. Sometimes we hit a phosphorus layer. So they dig the pond and then there's this layer of phosphorus at the bottom of the pond because we mine phosphorus over here in this part of the state. And so if there's phosphorus just sitting there, then any kind of nitrogen that comes in just, makes a beautiful environment for things to grow. And unfortunately, it's usually not what we want to grow. So the way that they're structured, the sediment, what's at the bottom of the pond plays a lot into how these function and work too. But let's move on. Okay, again, when it rains, you've got the water that hits the roof. It's carrying whatever's from the roof on. And this is where I like to pause and say, a lot of people don't understand our lightning storms actually drop nitrogen out of the sky for us. There's nitrogen in the air, and electricity or lightning actually has a process in it that can cause the nitrogen to fall with the rain, which is great for our plants and our grass, and that's why we see that beautiful green, after a nice electrical storm. But all that rain hitting our roofs and sidewalks and driveway and just running straight off into a pond is also carrying a lot of nitrogen in it. And nitrogen is one of the leading nutrients needed for things to grow, including algae. So if we have a lot of nitrogen in our pond, then that makes it a great environment for algae to grow in there. So all of these things, including grass clippings, if we've over fertilized or have fertilizer on hard surfaces, all of those are going to drain with the water into the pond or run with the water into the pond. And then anything on the roads, and sidewalks and driveways, gas, oil, whatever, it all ends up in these stormwater ponds. And that's their function and purpose. That's why we have them. That's why they were designed, was to catch all of this stuff before it enters into our natural bodies of water. But, and this is where people get upset sometimes when I'm talking about stormwater ponds, because again, they were sold lakefront property or, this beautiful pond setting. And it is truly a stormwater pond, if that's what you have. And most of them, especially from Central to South Florida, are truly stormwater ponds, engineered to take this runoff. And so if it is a true stormwater pond, then it's really like a ditch. And I'm sorry that I'm saying that, but that's really what it is. It is taking all this stormwater runoff and the pollution and carrying it into a natural body of water, or just trying to get a treatment process in the interim, right? We're just trying to settle some of this stuff out in the meantime. But if we are overloading these ponds with too many nutrients and pollution, different types of pollutants, they can't do the processes like they should, and then they become out of balance, and then we start having some real problems with them, and we'll talk more about that. Okay, so here's a little picture that I borrowed from Redmont, Washington, that again just demonstrates it's raining, it's coming off of all the hard surfaces going into the storm drains in the road. So even if you do not live on a pond, you impact your pond because your home flows into a storm drain. The runoff will flow into a storm drain, which flows into the ponds. And so then we have our little pond there with our ducks, and then that will overflow once it fills to a certain level. It will overflow either into more ponds or out directly into a natural body of water. So why does this matter? This is a real picture. I actually took this at one of the communities that I was going out to try to help them with this situation. The blue is dye. A lot of times pond maintenance will put dye in the water. It's not to make it look like blue water. I mean, maybe somebody might request that, but typically it is to try to provide some shade. Plants also need light to grow, and if we can put some dye in the water and lessen the light availability to the algae, especially the type that starts growing at the bottom of the pond, then we can slow the algae growth. I'm not going to say that dye will get rid of the algae growth, but it can slow it down because it doesn't have as much light available to utilize for the growth. So all of these nutrients that end up in our water and pollutants, they just can cause these types of situations. And you can see in this pond, we had a drought, and so the water levels were very low, which means that there's more light availability, which means that the water is probably warmer because there's, it's not as deep and the light can penetrate through and warm it up. So yeah, it was kind of a mess, but it looks much better now, I will say. So, our common pollutions, or pollutants, you hear about these all the time. Fertilizer, we have to be really cognizant of our fertilizer use. Do we really need it? Sometimes we may not. Sometimes, we are seeing a commercial that says, hey, it's spring, let's fertilize. But we have done some research and know that older landscapes have a lot of organic material in them, and we can at least cut our recommendation, the University of Florida Extension, IFAS Extension recommendations can be cut back to half if the landscape is 7 to 10 years old. They found that we can really cut back on those rates. Grass clippings, we do not want those to end up in stormwater ponds, so allowing those to stay on roads and sidewalks will, let them end up in there as soon as it rains or irrigation goes off. Pet waste, sometimes we forget about this one to scoop our poop, but I did some testing in a neighborhood and we actually had to sign the ponds, do not swim or eat fish from these ponds, because the bacteria level was so high in those ponds that we needed to put signs up to warn people to kind of, be very cautious around those ponds. And much of that bacteria is from pet waste. So we need to be careful and make sure we're scooping our poop. Even if, again, we don't live on a pond, we're draining to a pond in most cases. And then we have the sediment that can end up in there too, and things that are on the ground, antifreeze and whatnot, but also sediment. So in your yard, if you have a bunch of bare spots, you need to try to do something to cover them up, because when it rains, that soil moves. And not only do you lose your soil, but it ends up in our stormwater. And most of Florida's soils have phosphorus in them, so that can create some problems in the pond. Florida-friendly landscape, it's always the solution, right? But it is a great guide to help us with our ponds. There are several principles that really impact ponds. And I always talk about with communities when I go out, they're pointing at this pond. This looks terrible. Look at all this algae. And I say, these 3 fingers are pointing back at you guys and telling me things about the pond. I talk about the pond being a report card. So if you have reclaimed water for irrigation and a lot of that's flowing into the pond, reclaimed water has a lot of nutrients in it, like nitrogen and phosphorus. So all that ending up in the pond can cause some problems. But when we're choosing the right plant in the right place, we hopefully can lessen some of the maintenance, lessen some of the needs of that plant. Not saying take it away, plants still have needs, but maybe not as many needs if it's growing in the suitable location for the plant. It's kind of like if you're eating right and well rested, you can probably avoid some illnesses out there. If you go to the store and somebody coughs on you, you're pretty healthy, so you can avoid some of those illnesses. But if you're not sleeping well, not eating well, stressed out, then you're more likely to get the illnesses. And it's true of our plants too. If they're not growing in the right places, they're more likely to have problems. And then we address those problems with either extra fertilizer or pesticides or extra water. And so having the right plant in the right place can help reduce some of that. Fertilizing appropriately, again, make sure you need to fertilize. We don't always need to fertilize. And I have a whole bunch of landscape plants in my yard that don't ever get any. Between the grass clippings and the mulch decomposing, they are getting what they need, and they're blooming and they're green and they're doing very well. Now, I'm not saying don't fertilize. I'm saying make sure it's necessary, that you need the fertilizer before you just throw fertilizer out because it's March and somebody said it's time to fertilize. Attracting wildlife is always great. We always want to attract wildlife, and when we do it in our yard, we can also bring them in for around the pond too, and they can help with that ecosystem in the pond and help balance things out. Another Florida-friendly principle is protecting the waterfront, and that includes maintaining vegetative buffers along the edge, and that's mainly what we're going to talk about throughout this talk. So with your fertilizers, Florida Friendly Landscaping has a website and an app that can help you know your local ordinance. And at the end of this presentation, I have a whole smorgasbord of QR codes. And one of those is for the Florida Friendly Ordinance website that you can go there and find out what your fertilizer ordinance is. You type in your address and it will tell you what your ordinance is. And that's important to know. You only really should be applying fertilizer when the turf or plants are growing. That's when they need to eat, not in the winter. We don't want to do this before a rain, and if we may have a spill, we definitely want to clean that up so it doesn't end up in our water. We only want to irrigate when needed. A lot of what we see in our area, and I think we see again in this part of the state, it's kind of from central on down south, is compacted soil, especially in new developments. And when we have these really hard compacted soils, the water doesn't perk through the soil like it should. And so you turn on your irrigation, and even though for that zone and that plant material, let's say you should irrigate for 15 minutes, but after 5 minutes, all the water is just running off the site because it's compacted soil. And when it runs off the site, it's carrying with it some stuff, and it's going into the storm drains and into the ponds. So there is a method called cycle and soak that you can use, where you split up the time on your timer, your controller, and water a little bit and let that, so you do 5 minutes, go through every zone, come back 5 minutes every zone, and that gives the soil an opportunity to open up a little bit and take the water. So making sure we're not over irrigating, because that just pushes all that water into the storm ponds. Also, if it's reclaimed water, we've already talked about how that's a problem. We want to adjust the timer seasonally. Why is this important? Well, in the winter, the plants aren't growing so much, so they don't need so much. So they don't need all the water that they need in the spring when it's really dry and they're starting to wake up and grow, and in the summer if we're not getting our summer rains. So we can adjust those controllers, and we say skip a week in the winter. Then if it's really cold, we can just turn it off altogether until it warms back up, because the plants don't need it when we're experiencing that cooler weather. We want to inspect our systems so that we don't have missing heads. The systems are supposed to run in the middle of the night, so you're likely not seeing the problems out there. So you do need to, once a month during the active season, get out there and turn it on and make sure that everything's working properly and you don't have a bunch of leaks. And you want to also make sure that the sprinklers aren't hitting your driveways and sidewalks or the road, because again, that's just pushing it right into the pond. So let's get into these vegetative buffer zones. We would like to see them, the buffer zone from the water's edge, we'd like to see it back 10 to 15 feet. But in a lot of communities that I work in, that's really not doable. So we like 6 feet. 6 feet's great. 10 to 15's better. But something is better than nothing is where we're having to end up, especially on these very small lot lines. So 6 feet around that water's edge is great. And why are we doing this? Because it will help with some of that erosion. If you put plants in, well, let me back up. There's something called a root to shoot ratio. So the taller the shoot on a plant, the deeper the root is for that plant. So you want plants that are a bit taller so they have deeper root systems so that they can hold those shorelines in place. So if we're keeping turf growing right up to the water's edge and we're mowing that, it doesn't need a very big root system to support that turf. And those grass clippings also have a bigger likelihood of ending up in the water. Even if we direct them away, they still have a bigger likelihood of ending up in the water. So having some type of buffer zone around the edge is helpful, especially with erosion. It can also help filter some of those grass clippings before they get into the pond. I planted a couple of ponds here commercially for Manatee County, and we found that those buffer zones catch trash before they get into the pond. And now instead of somebody having to wade into the pond to get the trash out of the pond, they can just walk around the edge, or with their mowers and their little pick 'em up things, sticks that they have, they can pick up the trash just going around the edge of the pond instead of having to get in there. So buffers have a lot of great purposes, good reasons to have them. So when we talk about buffer zones, sometimes it gets a bit confusing because there is the littoral zone, which is a buffer zone also, but that buffer zone is mainly in the water. So when we're looking at the water, we have those in the deeper parts of the water, the submerged plants. And then as we come up closer to the shore and get a little more shallow, we could have some floating plants like lilies and spatterdock, or lotus. We find those growing about 10 to 12 feet deep. And then as we get up to the very near edge, we've got the emergent plants. So those are, in this case, it's picturing cattails, and sometimes that is what's there, but sometimes it's more like a purple flowering pickler weed or a white flowering duck potato. The great thing about these plants that are right up next to the edge of the pond but still in the water is when we have wave action, they help reduce the energy. So if you look at my picture here, this is the shoreline. And you have waves coming, boom, 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 all the time in Florida. There's a ripple, a little bit of wind, ripple, bigger wind, bigger wave. And so it's wearing at that shoreline, and it's causing it to cliff, is what we call it. And then it'll actually slough off and move its way back and back. But now we have a shoreline, and now we have plants in front of that shoreline. And so when the wave comes in, it hits those plants, and it actually diffuses some of the energy of the wave, and it doesn't hit the shoreline as hard, and so it helps reduce that erosion. So that's from the water side. We can reduce erosion that way. Then we have the buffer zone that's on the shoreline side or the land side, and those are plants, terrestrial plants. Those are not aquatic plants that we would use, and we're going to talk about that as we move along. So how we manage these shorelines, we really don't want to mow to the edge or string trim to the edge. We really need those root systems to be in place. And if we're doing that, then we're probably going to have that nutrient, the grass clippings, ending up in the water. We want to use native vegetation. If we're using invasive vegetation or exotic, sometimes it takes over, and it takes over our native plants. So our native wildlife don't have access to some of the food that they may need. And also the plants can help stabilize those bare soils, help stabilize that shoreline. You also want to be sure, a lot of people relate their ponds to like a dump area. A lot of people have used water bodies for, cleaning off things or getting rid of things, and we don't want to do that. These stormwater ponds get enough pollution and problems without us contributing more to them. So we definitely want to make sure we're not using it as a dump site. Some of the plants that we can use are the pickler weed, which is pictured here, that little purple flowering plant, duck potato, which is a white flowering plant. Those would be, they're like tuberous type plants, and they grow in the water. They'll multiply. They can multiply quickly if you have a lot of nutrient in the water. If there's a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus available to them, they can multiply quickly. And sometimes we talk about using a pond as a demonstration pond and looking at the, how it can work with the different types of plants in there. And then if you have this kind of overgrowth, you can remove those plants and use them in other ponds. So you could use them in other pond sites. Muley grass and Fakahatchee grass would be types of native plants that we could use up on that shoreline side. And then this blue flag iris down at the bottom here, the little blue, more bluey plant, is a good aquatic one. I find it to be a little temperamental though. If you're first planting, I would hold off on that one and let some things get established and then put it in a little bit later. It likes a bit organic material and all in there. So we do have a guide that Gail Hansen, she's one of our professors and specializes in landscape architecture. She and one of her grad students put this together. And I put the QR code here. Again, I have a whole smorgasbord of QR codes at the end of this presentation, and I will share that with Claire that she can send it out to everybody too, so you'll have the QR codes. But this book has selections of both water plants and shoreline plants. And the way that we, there's a lot of plants that you can choose from. And the way that she went about choosing plants for this book is we actually went out into the community, into focus groups and different events, and had people looking through pictures of plants and ordering them. So we chose what most people like. And the reason that we did this is so that we could use this book in homeowners associations, trying to get a consensus of what the group likes instead of just, one person's opinion. So these were the most popular among the groups. And then we have the bank slope plants also listed in this book. And you'll see, lots of different Florida-friendly plants listed here. Also in this booklet, there are some sample designs of how you can achieve both the water and the bank plantings. So there are, I think, 4 or 5 different designs in here. The one that's pictured at the top here is the lowest one, meaning it's like a ground cover that's along the bank, and then the littoral shelves, and then it goes up to bigger plants and some designs all the way up into some trees and some other designs. So you can morph this to your community or your shoreline. Let's say there's a preserve at the back of the property. So you could have some bigger plant material back there and then the smaller plant material up front. And then this one is showing just not mowing, and this is a concept that some folks are doing. I really say this should be a temporary fix. This should be only while you're trying to get some larger plants put in place. But if the worst case is you just stop mowing a few feet out from that bank and let those root systems get bigger. The root systems, again, can hold the soils in place. The problem with this concept is weeds are also in this area, and you can be a weed seed bank. So this, again, I really like to talk about as a temporary fix, not a permanent solution. All right, so there are definitely wildlife benefits, birds and butterflies, frogs, dragonflies. The biodiversity really can help in this system. Birds and the frogs and all, they can also help eat predators or some of the bad things that can come into bother the plants. So they can help with that ecosystem and the plants. Pet waste, again, we talked about this before. It definitely needs to be managed. You got to pick it up because it carries bacteria and parasites and also nutrients. There's nitrogen and phosphorus in that pet waste. So we definitely need to be scooping our poop as we are, living with our pets. That's one of the steps of having a pet is to clean up after them. All right, so what are some of the problems that we can see? Well, of course, algal blooms can be a big problem. And usually it's because we're out of balance. We've got more pollution, more nitrogen and phosphorus in the pond than the pond can handle. And so what do we do about that? Because it can be very harmful. That algae, it needs oxygen, and it takes the oxygen away from the fish and the other wildlife. So what can we do about that? Well, we have to look at ways upstream to start reducing our input what's getting into that pond and how can we reduce it? Can we have an even harsher fertilizer ordinance within our community if that's the problem? Can we talk about grass clippings? Can we put these buffer zones in place? Can we do irrigation audits within our community and have talks about these things so that our homeowners are educated and understand these things so that they understand their contribution to these problems in the ponds? Because our ponds are overloaded in many, many places, and they struggle. And unfortunately, the answer to this, it can only be a short-term solution, is to spray it away, right? So I talk about algae being like a headache. So when you see a bunch of algae in a pond, it's a symptom. It's a symptom of something else, something, inputs. Something's out of balance, and we need to figure out what that is. Just like with a headache, I can, if I get a headache, I can take some aspirin, and that might help my headache today. And if I keep doing it and keep doing it, I may need more and more aspirin to deal with my headache. And then I get to a point where I'm taking more aspirin than what the label says I'm allowed to take. And this is true of algae. We can spray it and we can spray it, and then it gets to a point where we can't keep spraying it because it becomes illegal. We're having to spray more than what the label allows us to. So my headache could be I have high blood pressure or I need my eyes examined, and my headache's just a symptom of those things, and that's what I need to take care of. I may need new glasses. If I take care of that, then I take care of my headache. And so algae is similar. We take care of an irrigation leak that we have, a huge source of water coming in that's full of nutrient. We take care of that, and it can take care of our algal problems. I did have a situation in one community where we were testing, trying to figure out why the water was turning this brown color, and we couldn't figure it out. And as soon as construction stopped in a home nearby, the water cleared up. So it was input. It was, just the input. In that case, it was probably largely sediment coming in. And that was the problem. So we got to look and see what those inputs are. Bank erosion is a huge problem. It can be very dangerous. It can be dangerous if you're walking around out there, because if you have St. Augustine or zoysia grass, it grows like this laterally across the top, and erosion can happen underneath it and you don't even see it. And then you step on the grass and you fall into a hole because it's eroded underneath the grass. And that can be very dangerous for homeowners walking around, but it can be super dangerous for maintenance folks, both the guys who spray the pond and gals who spray the pond, or the folks that do landscape maintenance. And we've unfortunately had two lawnmowers flip over here in Manatee County. In the past 7 years, there's been two lawnmowers that have flipped over and pinned the person underneath the water, and they drown. And that was because of an erosion issue on the bank, and it caused, that tire to slide and then the mower to tumble in. So it can be very dangerous, and we really need to do things to try to address bank erosion and prevent it. Fish kills. Fish kills can be a result of a couple of things. A lot of times we want to point a finger and say, oh, somebody was out here spraying and that's what caused the fish to kill. But sometimes we have a temperature change, like a heavy rain of cool water, and the water is really warm. And what that can do is it can cause the water to actually turn over in the pond because of the density of the water. So it can turn over, and the water that's been sitting on the bottom is now at the top, and it doesn't have as much oxygen in it. And unfortunately, the fish don't know to go down low for the oxygen, and so you'll see them up at the top with their mouths gasping for air up there, and that can cause a fish kill when we have those flip overs. It can happen when the temperature drops very quickly, and it can happen when we have a heavy rain. And then invasive plants. Boy, around here, torpedo grass is a real problem. It can create these mats that cover up the whole pond, it seems like. But invasive plants can not only be very aesthetically unappealing, but they can also choke up the system. So they can cause those outflows to get clogged up, and then we don't have the flood control that we need, and then we end up flooding ourselves because we haven't kept these inflows and outflows clear. So managing invasive plant material is very important in a stormwater pond. So this is a photo. This is the same pond. The water level is a lot different in the two pictures, I will say that. So it looks really bad in the top picture, which is the before picture. But we did come in and did some plantings at this pond to try to help with the shoreline. It was a kind of a steep bank and it was hard to mow. So the Homeowners Association wanted to plant it so that the mowers weren't, on that very steep slope. And so this is what we did. So it can be very attractive. When we planted this pond, this community has about 800 ponds. And we were invited to come in and help with this so that we could research it and get information to share with you guys. And so when we came in and planted this pond, all of a sudden the whole community wanted their ponds planted because it was beautiful. It looks great. It does take maintenance. I'm not going to say that you just plant it and forget it. There is some maintenance. It seems like after it's established and balanced, it's less maintenance than our traditional no plant turf to water design. But it does still take maintenance because weeds can get in there and we do have to manage that. And I will say with this design, we did learn something. It was our first one and we were working with the landscape installer, but they didn't understand quite what we were talking about and they left a strip of turf between the landscape bed and the pond. They thought that it would hold the mulch in place. When we're planting the banks, we're going to use pine straw. Pine straw will mat down and it won't move like chip mulch will. So we're going to use pine straw so it doesn't move. And so we don't need to leave like any kind of band of turf to hold that mulch in place. But they left a band of turf down there and what a maintenance nightmare that was. It ended up getting removed after they figured out that it was not fun to get down there and string trim and it defeated the purpose of the clippings in the water. So it did get removed eventually, but lesson learned. Don't put a little turf strip in between to try to catch the mulch. This is another resource that's available to you, and again, you can take a picture now or do your QR code now or at the end. But this is a lot of lessons that we've learned through research on pond buffer zones and installation, plant selection, and maintenance. So we put together a guide. I want to say it's about 40 pages and lots of information for you in there. So here we are to the smorgasbord of resources, lots and lots of helpful resources. So I just want to explain what these are, but I do need to move this picture box here so I can see them all. There we go. All right, so the first one at the top left is a stormwater pond website that I've put together with some of my colleagues in this area, and it's got lots of resources. These resources are all on there, as well as some more, including videos. So that is a nice place to start. I did a video the same talk a couple of years ago on stormwater ponds and their maintenance, and that is at the bottom of the same row. So it says video stormwater pond FFL. That was one of these talks that was more on stormwater ponds, and it talked about where to find your permits and original designs and things like that. So if you want to view that, it's down there and it's also at that website. And then in the middle of those, it says stormwater plant selection and design. That's that first guide that I showed you with the plants, both shoreline and bank side, as well as some design ideas in there for you. So the middle row is the Florida Friendly Landscaping website. That is their plant selection guide. If you want to get right to it, that's their QR code. We also have a stormwater plant database. So one of our researchers, Basil Iannone, worked with some students and some other folks to put together stormwater pond or stormwater plants aquatic plants essentially, and shoreline plants, but ones that work well around stormwater ponds. And they have it broken up into their traits. So if you want it for aesthetics, there's a list of that. If you want it for functionality, like erosion control, there's a list of that. And if you want it for wildlife, there's a list for that. So it's nicely sorted. It's an Excel file that you can sort yourself once you download it. So I highly recommend using that when you're planning. The bottom in the green still is EDIS Publications. That's our Ask IFAS website. So you go there and type in stormwater ponds or buffer zones, and you can find lots of information on those. Up at the top of the last row, local fertilizer ordinance, that is the FFL fertilizer ordinance app and website that you can go and find out what your local ordinance is. We've got the Stormwater Pond Buffer Zone Best Management Practices. That's the book that I just showed you prior to this page. And then if you want to reach out to your local extension office, which I would highly recommend, there is the QR code of our directory. There we go. A directory, and you can get the number and the address, the phone number and the address and contact of your local extension office. If they're not able to help you, a lot of times they'll reach out to either the state office, the FFL office. Sometimes they reach out to me because I do a lot of work with stormwater ponds. But I'm happy to work with them, and then we're all in the loop together because I don't know all the ordinances and codes in all the counties around Florida. So I always work with the local office whenever I'm involved. So hopefully this is a good list of resources for you. With that, I'm going to say thank you, and I'm going to look here. I've been yakking, but I haven't been paying attention at all to any of the questions.
Michelle, that's what I'm here for. So I will just ask them to you. You don't have to worry about it.
Oh,
It was a really great presentation. Thank you so much. We have a lot of people asking for the resources. And so I'm going to have Michelle email me those. And my email is in the chat box. So if you'd like those, go ahead, you can email me and I will send out all of those resources for you because I need some of those too. I haven't seen some of these. They look very, very helpful. And so I'm going to start throwing some questions at you.
great.
Okay, here's one that I think of. Some homeowners want the lawns cut all the way to the water's edge to control snakes and alligators. They say that if you let the grass grow, the snakes and gators will come out. What can we say to them?
Well, I have been really paying attention to that because I hear that one a lot. And I have been looking at the ponds that we've planted, where we've planted like 75% of the pond with higher, taller vegetation. And then we left an open area so that people could come and fish or launch a kayak or something like that. And guess where the gators bask? In the grass that was left and not up in the tall plants. We do not
Oh,
find them.
really? That's
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, they don't, they want to be, it's their belly that's on that stuff. So they don't want like rough Fakahatchee grass under their belly. So yeah, they're usually basking on a bit smoother surface, laying out there. And snakes are snakes. They get in your swimming pool. So you can have the cleanest edged cement bottom and you can still have snakes. It is Florida. The thing that attracts snakes is food. Typically, if there's a food source, then you're more likely to have them. So that's, unfortunately, there's no cure-all for any of those things. We do live in Florida and we do have to live beside the wildlife. I have not found anything except for food that encourages wildlife to come in. And yeah, most people enjoy the gators, actually. I hear more and more people, they name them and they watch them and see, oh, every day at 5 o'clock, he's over there.
Gator in our pond in my neighborhood. It's like a little holding pond to slow down the flow of a creek, and we get a gator in there every once in a while, and I get really excited whenever I see it. But I do have a bulkhead, though. I don't have a slope, so he's going in. So this would leads a good segue to my next question here. Do buffer zone recommendations differ for bulkheaded waterfronts?
They would, because of the moisture levels and also the soil. So you're just going to have to choose, the right plant for the right place situation. So when you have, higher, drier, you're going to need to choose plants that can tolerate that versus those that go right down into the water's edge that can tolerate saturated soils.
Okay. We had a few questions about plants to plant. I saw one about would spider plants work, but spider plants are classified as invasive by IFAS assessment right now. So no, we're not going to do spider plants.
No.
Which one of those resources again had some of the? I posted you guys too in the chat an EDIS document that Dr. Kayla Hansen wrote about plants that were good for waterfront stormwater ponds. So which one of these resources again was good for that?
It's this one right here in the middle of the first column. That's stormwater plant selection and design. That's Gail Hansen's
Right.
publication, and the fact sheet that you're referring to actually pulled from this publication.
Okay, that's great. And so the fact sheet had great resources for the different depths of water. So good plants that you would plant at the higher zones, and then as you get further down into the water, plants that thrive in there. And it's my understanding that almost all of those plants are native plants. Is
Correct.
that
They are.
true? And
Yes.
because like we want water plants spread, invasive plants, especially aquatic plants, spread very, very easily in the water. And so you want to make sure that you're planting an aquatic plant that is Florida friendly, and in this case, aquatic plants that are native, so that you don't have any risk of spreading. Okay,
Right.
I have one here. Oh shoot, where'd it go? Someone said, okay, I want to find it. I want to read it exactly. It was a question about weed control on the edge because she is the only one who is not. Okay, I'm sorry. Is there a type of, okay, it was the mulch. Is there any other, what about weed control if you're not spraying? And then we talked about the pine straw.
Yes. So
And so go ahead
pine
and
straw
weed the
is a
answer.
temporary, right? So when you first
Okay.
plant plants, they're not going to be super dense and tightly grown in. So the pine straw is there to lessen the weed pressure while the plants are growing in. But once everything's grown in, you should have a full coverage where there's not going to be light availability to weed seeds, and the weed seeds aren't going to be able to blow in as easily because there's that dense coverage. So you're going to plant these edges very densely. You need the root systems to be dense as well to hold the soils in place.
If you're not you're just not mowing or spraying, that's not enough. You need to be planting and mulching for the first time, for the first phase. And then hopefully once all of the shoreline plants grow in, you should have less weeds. Again, you should,
Yeah.
because there'll be just more competition for space and light and all of that. And so hopefully your plants will establish and compete, outcompete those weeds.
So I've done this, and a part of it is preparing your site before you plant, and you really need to make sure that you've prepped that site to clear it of the weeds, and that does involve spraying a few times.
Hmm.
And but we did this here in Manatee County, again with some research. We were trying to get some recommendations, and I just this year went back to one of the ponds, and they're doing some construction, so they needed some things cleared out, and I got involved and said, hey, who's doing the maintenance on this? And they said, we released the maintenance contract when you planted because we didn't want them interfering with your plantings. So in 5 years, there's not been any pond maintenance on that pond. All that there's been is the landscaper mowing around the edge of the plants. And yeah, there were some weeds in there, but it wasn't horrific. It was pretty good. So yeah, once it grows in and it's pretty dense, it can be its own little ecosystem. We are going to need to manage it. These are man-made systems. It's not a natural lake that's going to operate like it does in nature. So we've got weed seeds that are constantly coming in from the landscape. So we are going to have to manage it a little bit. But once it gets up and running and grows in densely, it's not a lot to manage.
Okay, well, this question is about a municipality, but I have a feeling that would also apply to HOA or CDD leadership. My town mows right to the edge of ponds and city parks. How can we promote these BMPs for public spaces or within your community?
You got to get involved and you got to, suggest. We are extension and we love to go out and talk to people, but we have to be invited. We can't throw ourselves in and say, you need to do this. It has to be an invitation. So start talking to your leadership, whether it's county, your local city, or an HOA, CDD. Talk to them. Let us get involved and educate folks on why this is beneficial and how it can help out. Um, that's the only way I know to do it is, be the change, right?
And so a very practical way for anything that you see in any of these websites that I'm sorry, webinars that have to do with your HOA or your municipal leadership is Michelle was right. Like extension agents, it makes them look really, really good if they did lots of presentations to decision makers in their county. And that's a part of their job is speaking and educating the public on this. And so if you want to, I'm going to post this in the chat in a second. You can find your local county extension agent. I have the website where you can look up the contact information to their office and invite them. Say, I want you to come speak to my board. Here's my board president's number. We meet on, I maybe not meet, you don't want to ambush them at the meetings, but like these when we have our meetings. We would love to have you do a 10-minute presentation on beneficial pond management because I'm sick of my pond looking this way and I'm sick of seeing all of these inputs in our pond. Like, use your community and, just as you vote in your city or your county, you pay to live in these communities. And so like have them reflect your values. You can do that. And that's something that we really encourage everybody to advocate for FFL practices wherever they live. Okay, I had another question, and I assumed I answered some of it because I made an assumption, but I'm going to have you clarify. Are these plants good for salty or brackish water?
So there are plants that are good for salty water, but not the majority of the plants that are in these stormwater guides. They are for freshwater systems, but we do have some resources for like salt marsh or tidal zone plants, living shorelines that can tolerate those salty areas.
So I've been doing a little dive into living shorelines recently.
Hmm.
And so I'm going to post those in the chat as well. If you live
Great.
on the coast, and your sand or your coastline is eroding in front of your property, you can plant a living shoreline, or you can plant kind of like a hybrid of to for your seawalls, and kind of put in some oyster habitat, put in some spots for native planting in front of your seawall to reduce the effects of erosion in front of your property. And so I'm going to post those in here as well. There are some really good EDIS documents talking you how to get the permits for installing a living shoreline, and there's a whole website about living shoreline, so it's pretty cool. So I'm going to post those
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, it's the same concept. You got to reduce the energy of those waves coming in. So plant material and like you're saying, the oyster, clusters or oyster balls. There's lots of ways to achieve it with some hard surfaces because those waves are real that are coming from the coastline. And sometimes you need those harder materials to help with that, the energy dispersion.
Okay, everybody. I think that is the end of our question and answer session today. I learned a lot. Hope you guys did too.
I do want to say one
Oh,
more
go
thing
ahead.
because we were talking about alligators, and since we have just a couple minutes, I'm getting involved with a research project that's here in Manatee and Sarasota County, and it's with one of the researchers from Moat Marine. He's well known for shark tagging, the great white shark tagging. He is known for his efforts with that, and he's working with us to gator tag. And so we're going to tag, well, they've already started actually. They've measured and taken blood samples and all kinds of stuff and put tags on gators. And now we're tracking to see what these gators in these communities do all day. Where do they go? What are they doing? it's
No.
Yeah, so it's pretty interesting. We will hopefully have a feed up in the not too distant future that you can actually watch and see where they're going. It's not going to be a live feed because we don't want somebody to go, stumble upon the gator. So it'll be like a day or two delay. But they're going to put a display in Moat Marine here in Sarasota that will show the gator tracking, and then we'll also have access to put it on our websites too. So we're really interested. Are they like the cattle in the field where at 2 o'clock they're always in that spot over there? you know so I'm excited to see what happens, and maybe next year I can come back and talk about that.
This is like why this is the perks of living in Florida. This no one else is having gator tagging, live tracking in other states. Maybe Louisiana, but okay, well, just remember if you want links to some of these QR codes, if you haven't had the chance to open them up or you don't have a kind of phone that will open it, email me, and my email is in the chat box. We also have some of the way to find your local county extension agent to invite them to do a presentation to your board or to your community. And then also this webinar will be posted on the FFL YouTube page, and I'm gonna put if you look for Florida Friendly Landscaping YouTube, that's where it's gonna be posted. And they're posting pretty quickly, and you can review this here as well. So thank you so much, Michelle,
Thank you
and
for having me.
yeah, and we will see everybody at our next webinar.
Right. Bye bye.